So the question in the teaching is, who is my neighbor and what am I to do? It seems so incredibly clear that when we see a neighbor who's being abused, that our job is to stop, help, get the person to safety, and pay the bill. And like I say, I don't know where that church was when, this passage gets read, because they clearly were not paying attention. But for example, in the Quran, the first verse in the chapter entitled The Women establishes the equal nature of men and women and reminds each gender that God is a witness to their fulfillment of their mutual rights. And for those of us who are not Muslim, I must admit being surprised when I began to study Islam and study with my colleagues, the clarity in the Quran about the affirmation of women and the equality of men and women. It's not something I had expected because it's not part of my tradition. It's not that clear. But it says this, O mankind, reverence your guardian Lord who created you from a single soul, created of like nature its mate, and then both scattered like seeds countless men and women. Fear God through whom you demand your mutual rights, and reverence the wombs that bore you, for God ever watches over you. And the Quran provides guidance for male and female relations, describing believing men and women as friends and protectors of one another. And then in Christian Testament, the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, do not provoke your children to anger, but raise them up in the way of the Lord. Now, in terms of parenting, this verse is preceded by the commandment to honor your parents, which is part of the Ten Commandments. And it seems to me that this verse is the corrective to something that was going on that was distorting the commandment to honor your parents. Because otherwise, why comment on the commandment? The comment is, honor your parents, and parents, do not provoke your children to anger, but raise them up in the way of Jesus. And we all know that nothing produces anger like being abused. So we have correctives even within the text, if we would only pay attention to them. In Jewish teaching, the notion of Shalom Bayit, peace in the home, which I mentioned in the list of problematic texts and teachings, only because it is misused and misinterpreted. Misused to say that peace in the home means silence, means that the woman alone is responsible for keeping things under control and quiet, keeping secrets. But that's not what Shalom Bayit means. It means real peace in the home that is everyone's responsibility. It means peace which also requires justice to be authentic. But many women, many Jewish women I've spoken with have talked about how the teaching of Shalom Bayit has been what has kept them quiet and in an abusive situation for years. And finally, one of the parables from Luke's Gospel is one of my favorites, often referred to as the story of the persistent widow in Luke 18. This was the woman, and again, we don't know her story, but I bet we do know her story. The woman, something had been done to her. She had a grievance, and she came to the judge and presented her grievance. And I think she probably was a victim of violence. She presents her grievance and asks to be vindicated by the court. The judge is described as a judge who does not care and does not fear God, and really can't be bothered with this. Go away. And those of you who worked in the judicial system have probably had this experience with women trying to get restraining orders and being sent away. But this woman, this widow, goes back, makes her case again. Judge sends her away. This goes on for 4 or 5 visits. And finally, the text says, the judge finally grants her vindication because he is tired of her coming here and bothering him. But you know, for her, she got what she needed. And what vindication meant for her, we can assume in terms of the community she was in, vindication meant being set free from the shame that had been put upon her because she'd been victimized. Because the court finally said, no, this was not right, what was done to you. So that meant for her a restoration to her community, and that's what she was going for. And at that point, she didn't care whether the judge cared or not. She just needed that institutional response. Now, obviously, it would have been better if the judge actually cared, but we'll take what we can get. Which is a reminder to all of us to be realistic about what we're going for and what we get. But the teaching in that passage is to pray always and not lose heart. And the notion that we may go back and go back and go back. But it says if the judge, the unjust judge, finally grants justice to this woman, surely God will grant justice to the people. So my prayer every day is that that be so. But it's a function of our efforts. So let me just talk briefly about justice, and then we're going to have some time to talk about whatever you want to talk about. Because justice in the context of dealing with domestic violence and sexual assault is often limited to that discussion of the judicial system that I just referred to in a box over here. And I'm sure some of you have been involved in efforts to make those changes, the changes that we were hearing about from the officer in terms of the way cases are dealt with and so forth. And all that's really important. But it may not be about justice. Because justice is something else. And for people of faith, justice is a deeply theological experience. And I want to talk about justice as what is fundamentally needed for real healing for any of us. And most of what I've learned about this, I've learned over the years listening to victims and survivors. And when I was young and stupid, having just graduated from Yale Divinity School, that's when you think you know a lot and you have a lot of answers. And as I would work with an individual victim, I would feel compelled to give them all the answers. And eventually, I stopped